Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to another explainer, where we take a complex and honestly, often heavily debated topic and break it down using nothing but the source material, clear data, and a bit of structure. Today, we're tackling a subject that is frequently surrounded by political spin and intense emotion: national crime statistics. Now, our goal here isn't to validate any particular political narrative, not at all. Instead, we're going to use pure, objective data from the FBI, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and leading criminological research to uncover the real, structural drivers behind crime rates. We're going to build a shared foundation of facts so we can understand what is actually happening in our communities.
So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, demystifying per capita. Second, official statistics. Third, the economic equalizer. Fourth, geographic density and intraracial realities. And finally, number 5, constructive takeaways.
Section 1. Demystifying per capita.
Before we look at any sensitive demographic data, we absolutely have to establish a shared, completely neutral mathematical foundation. We just can't have an honest conversation about crime without understanding how we measure it. To do that, we need to talk about the critical difference between raw numbers and per capita rates, drawing directly from the Stanford Racial Justice Act toolkit. Let's use a really simple, non-charged analogy here. Imagine 2 school districts. District A has 10,000 students, and let's say 100 of them get suspended in a year. District B has only 1,000 students, but 50 of them get suspended. If you only look at the raw numbers, the literal count of incidents, District A looks twice as bad, right? I mean, 100 is greater than 50. But that completely skews reality. When you standardize the data, calculating the rate per capita, or per 100 students, you suddenly realize that only 1% of District A's students were suspended, compared to a massive 5% in District B. You see, standardizing data isn't some sort of political trick. It's a strict mathematical necessity for making an honest comparison across unequal groups.
Looking at the absolute counts of defendants from the Stanford toolkit, we see a stark volume of individuals. But looking at raw differences like this serves only as a starting point. Sure, it shows us a volume, but it doesn't account for the essential context, like the underlying population size. To find the truth, we must always view data proportionally.
Section 2. Addressing the official statistics head-on.
Okay, now that we have our mathematical baseline, it's time to apply it to the actual official demographic crime data provided by federal agencies like the FBI and the Bureau of Justice Statistics. We're going to begin with the demographic baseline. Black Americans comprise roughly 13 to 14% of the total U.S. population. Keep that baseline in the back of your mind, because it really sets the stage for understanding the disproportionate realities within our justice system.
We have to address the data head-on, without evasion or bias. Despite making up roughly 13 to 14% of the population, this demographic accounts for over half of known homicide arrests and victims nationwide. We are stating this plainly and neutrally. Let me be clear, this is not a moral judgment. It is strictly an empirical, public safety reality. Hiding from uncomfortable facts does a massive disservice to the very communities that are most impacted by this violence. We must use these numbers not as an endpoint, but as a completely necessary starting point for a deeper investigation.
But as we dig deeper, we have to avoid a massive analytical trap. The Urban Institute defines this perfectly as the ecological fallacy. Essentially, this is the mathematical error of mistaking statistical trends in large groups for individual behavior. What this means in plain English is that broad racial disparities in national crime statistics absolutely cannot be applied to the inherent nature of individuals. There is literally no biological or cultural predictor of violence tied to race. None. So if race isn't the driver, what is?
Well, that brings us to the pivotal question of this entire explainer. Why do the numbers look this way? We are shifting our focus right now from what the numbers are to deeply investigating the environmental and economic conditions that actually cause them.
Section 3. The economic equalizer and neighborhood factors.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how incredibly illuminating the data becomes. Criminological research has largely shifted from viewing crime through a racial lens to viewing it through an economic one, focusing heavily on concentrated poverty. There's a surprisingly fascinating piece of data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics that completely flips the common narrative on its head. When sociologists isolate for identical environments, meaning they look at low-income urban white neighborhoods and low-income urban black neighborhoods that have the exact same levels of unemployment and family instability, the violent victimization rates align almost perfectly. In fact, poor urban whites experienced violent victimization at a rate of 56.4 per 1,000 compared to 51.3 for poor urban blacks. When poverty and urban environments are equalized, the racial disparity totally vanishes.
Poverty is the ultimate equalizer here, and the primary driver. The BJS report shows us that economic distress creates similar vulnerabilities virtually everywhere. To put that into perspective, poor persons in urban areas have a violent victimization rate of roughly 44 per 1,000, which is strikingly similar to poor persons in rural areas at nearly 39 per 1,000. Desperation, a lack of resources, and economic distress fuel crime regardless of whether you're looking at a crowded inner-city block or a completely isolated country road.
And decades of peer-reviewed research absolutely back this up. As researcher Patrick Sharkey notes, violence is a consequence of urban inequality. It is a product of segregation, disinvestment, abandonment, and the resulting decline in community institutions. It's the systemic lack of opportunity and underfunded infrastructure that create the breeding grounds for crime, not the genetic makeup of the people living there.
Section 4. Geographic density and intraracial realities.
And this brilliantly illustrates the next piece of our puzzle, the physical spaces where this crime actually happens. We have to understand how geographic distribution, historical policies, and urban density heavily influence those national per capita averages we talked about earlier. Spatial distribution data from Chicago proves that violence isn't just evenly spread out, it is fiercely localized in specific disadvantaged neighborhoods. Because a higher percentage of the U.S. black population lives in major, high-density metropolitan areas compared to the white population, which is more geographically spread out, urban density alone naturally pulls those national per capita crime averages dramatically upward for minority populations.
Furthermore, we really need to talk about proximity. A Bureau of Justice Statistics breakdown of violent crime from 2012 to 2015 reveals a critical reality. 57% of white victims were victimized by white offenders, and 63% of black victims were victimized by black offenders. Crime is inherently localized and intraracial. People generally commit crimes against the folks who live right next to them. Because our neighborhoods remain largely segregated by both income and geography, crime is driven by physical proximity and local conditions, absolutely not by cross-racial animosity.
So, the crucial point is understanding how communities got so densely concentrated in the first place. Research, like Richard Powell's dissertation out of CUNY, shows that historical government practices, like redlining, literally categorize certain minority communities as too risky for investment. This artificially concentrated poverty and geographic density over decades, starving these areas of capital, public housing support, and jobs. The institutional decay we see today is a direct mathematical consequence of those historical, discriminatory government policies.
Section 5. The path forward and constructive takeaways.
Okay, so we've looked at the math, we've looked at the maps, and we've explored the structural causes. Now let's synthesize all these facts to reframe the narrative and talk about real-world solutions. Here are the key takeaways you should walk away with today. The data proves, without a doubt, that the root causes of per capita crime disparities are economic disadvantage, geographical density, systemic resource gaps, and a historical lack of community investment. Therefore, if we want to actually lower crime rates, our solutions must target these specific structural areas. We have to strengthen communities, rebuild local institutions, and create economic opportunity, rather than unfairly profiling populations based on a misunderstanding of statistical data.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought. When we see a high per capita crime rate in a specific demographic, will we continue to use that statistic as a final, judgmental label? Or will we start using it as it was always intended, as a diagnostic tool that alerts us to severe structural inequality and concentrated poverty? Crime is a solvable structural challenge, but only if we have the courage to read the data correctly. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep looking at the data.